My purpose is threefold today. First of all, to tell you a little bit about us, that's us, and what we know of the thousands of small local charities that will be in each of your areas. Secondly, to tell you why we think they matter, and why some matter more than others. And third, to tell you that even with austerity and tight budgets, there's an enormous amount that each of you in this room can do to secure the future of those organisations and the future they will play in shaping the lives of people who live in every area that you live in. I first of all just wanted to check, how many of you are currently connected to a local charity? Can you put your hands up? So, most people in the room. And how many of you have worked in or worked with a local charity as a trustee or a member of staff? So there's a lot of people who will know the sector. That's really good to hear. So, let me start by disappointing you. As Jane has said, we're independent of, but funded by the bank. I am not from the bank, so I'm not about to solve your financial woes, unfortunately. But after disappointing you, let me also reassure you that I am the only charity chief executive you will ever meet who will never ask you for money. I promise, but there will be an ask, and I'll come to that. So at the foundation, we share the same agenda as each of you in this room. We care deeply about people and about communities. For 35 years, we focused on small local organisations that reach people that sit in each of your patches. Austerity has challenged us just as it's challenged you. It's challenged us because we can only fund hundreds when we'd love to fund thousands. It's challenged us because before 2008, we had what we called a cake model, where funders like us were typically the icing and marzipan and what was a very rich fruitcake of ingredients from local authorities and police and crime commissioners and central government and the NHS. Since 2008, that's changed. We're increasingly part of the cake. And it's challenged us to ask where we add the most value as a foundation with a limited resource, but actually a focus and disadvantage. So, as austerity has hit, we refocused our work on people who live with what we call complex social issues. Not just them and the way it affects their lives, but the way it affects your whole communities. And the organisations that we think reach them best. These are people who face really visible issues, homelessness, learning disability, drugs, alcohol, mental health, and increasingly post-Savile and post-Rotherham, the outfalling of adverse child exploitation, which has resulted in a huge number of adults who come forward having been sexually abused historically, that small charities tend to deal with. But also some invisible issues, and we've heard some of them in the last session, like drugs, like refugees, like asylum seekers, like domestic abuse, like trafficking and modern slavery. And we fund around 700 small local organisations, and all of them have an income of less than £1 million. And it's worth remembering when we talk about the voluntary sector that the household names you will know, Cancer Research, Children's Society, National Trust, are 3% of charities. 97% of charities are small and local to you, with a turnover of less than £1 million. And the vast majority aren't just small, they are local. And our work tackles the myth that the leafy shires are all pockets of wealth, whether it's homelessness in Surrey, where we fund organisations like Elmbridge Rent Start, or domestic abuse, where we fund organisations like Cheshire Without Abuse in Cheshire. Around a third of the local charities that we support, focused on complex social issues, operate in or operate from the areas where you work as county councils and district councils. But we don't just fund them, we help them develop as organisations in what for them has been a really tough environment since 2008. And we try to influence that environment, which is why I'm speaking to you today. But that 700 we fund is just a small part of a huge jigsaw, a colourful kaleidoscope of well over 120,000 small local charities, all with a turnover of under £1 million, and many much, much smaller, but clearly many of you already know. Now, as I stand here today, I know the work we do at the foundation is a lot easier than the job you have. We don't have statutory duties. We can select what we fund, how we fund, and who we fund. And we know whether you're elected officials or you're appointed officials. Many of you have engaged with the sector, as you just said. We know the huge financial pressures you face and the challenges and choices you've had to make since 2008, which have been tough. So last year, we published with the New Policy Institute a document called Quiet Price Crisis, which echoes what the IFS was saying yesterday and has said previously in some of its data, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, that you've lost a fifth of your revenue in the last 10 years, and that some of you have had a very little choice to focus on what you have to do in statute, not necessarily what you want to do in practice or what you think you should do in conscience. The recent new local government network leadership index, which they publish every year, told us that half of chief execs in county councils and councils across the country were spending half of what they would like on prevention. Homelessness is a really good point in case. We used MHCLG data to look at homelessness expenditure through the New Policy Institute document, and it showed that there has been a 40% reduction in spend on preventing homelessness, a 40% reduction in spend on preventing, and a 58% increase on crisis support for people largely in temporary supported accommodation, that shift from prevention to crisis. Now, whilst we, like you, are waiting to see what happens on December the 12th, whatever is promised, we don't think it's going to look an awful lot better. The battleground in the election seems to be the NHS, police, immigration, not frankly local authority spending. We would share an agenda with you that local authorities need to be properly funded for what you do. Because perhaps you've done too good a job at absorbing some of the cuts that have happened. But even if the spending review, depending on whose data you believe from yesterday, there's a significant reduction between 4 and 7 billion is the gap in local authority funding in county councils alone by 2025. So given this context, you could be forgiven for asking, what's the role of local small charities in meeting your statutory needs when there are so many of them? And frankly, not all of them are even good. And boy, are they really hard to manage. I was thinking about, especially in groups, I was thinking about what the collective noun might be for a group of small local charities, maybe an agony of, or a nuisance of, or a confusion of. But equally, it could be a passion of, or a commitment of. And I think it's interesting thinking about the role of small local charities that you will know. You could be forgiven too for focusing primarily on price or unit cost. And you could be forgiven for directing your efforts to larger organisations, not least for reasons of transactional efficiency. Understandable. As money have got tighter, we've asked the same thing of ourselves. And actually, before I came to the foundation, I spent most of my career working in large organisations. I was a senior civil servant. I'd run a national charity. And as a moderately well-adjusted middle-class guy, I had an inkling that there were lots of small charities that were doing kind of good stuff. I frankly had no idea the kind of work that they do up and around the country in the county councils and district councils in which you work. So, as a foundation, a couple of years ago, we decided to ask ourselves some soul-searching. We said, what's the value of small? What's the value of local? It was a pretty risky question, having invested over recent years the budget of East Sussex County Council in small local charities. So we commissioned Sheffield University to ask that question, what's the value of small? And last year we published a report called The Value of Small by Sheffield University, an independent report. And it asked that question, are small charities part of the answer, or are they part of the problem in the confusion they can create? And we thought they were distinctive from the research. The research told us they were distinctive in 3 ways. First of all, in what they do, and for whom. They are first responders. They create spaces where people feel safe and respected. They're culturally sensitive. They're very good at dealing with diversity in communities. Secondly, in how they work. They're person-centered. They're embedded in communities, run by people within communities for other people in communities. They have an open-door policy. Because they're small, they can make really quick decisions and they're flexible. There's not much of a gap between the board and the chief executive or director and the frontline staff. That might be the only layers they have. So they're able to respond quickly. And where they do that, they create strong local networks. The report described them as the glue in communities, holding things together, building partnerships. They are more than the sum of their parts. But this is about their core work. We asked also, how do they create value? What would be of interest to you as councillors and as officials? What value do they create in your communities? And we found that their distinctiveness enables them to add value in 3 ways. First of all, they generate value for people in your local communities because they build strong, trusted relationships with them. Because they support the whole person rather than provide a specific siloed service. Secondly, because they reach the people who are the hardest for you to reach. Those furthest from the labour market, people like gangs, those with complex needs. Communities who often don't access statutory services because, frankly, they don't trust statutory services. And thirdly, they're able to think local and act personal, which is a key issue for local communities as they become more fragmented. Paradox for me, and from the work I've seen with the work we do at the Foundation, is that the small local organisations are the best equipped to deal with the most complex social issues facing individuals because of the flexible way in which they can respond. Secondly, they generate value for your local economies and your local services. because they help people achieve those long-term outcomes that stop them having to go the revolving door of one-size-fits-no-one services and therefore reduce pressure on some of your really expensive services, social care, A&E, mental health support, general practice, the police. And because they're local, they use local supply chains and they employ local people. So the money isn't going out of your area. In that respect, they're green, given the comments on climate change yesterday. And thirdly, they generate value for your local communities because they bring people together and develop social capital. Through volunteer opportunities, they bring in more skills and more resources, often tens of thousands of pounds worth. Small charities in particular have far more volunteers per pound they spend than large charities, not tens more, hundreds more. The level of engagement of small charities relative to large charities is enormous. And the ones they use as volunteers do so much more. Volunteers in local charities are not running cake stalls and tombolas for Macmillan. They're often running frontline services for people in crisis. Not least because many of the people who are volunteers were in crisis once themselves and are giving back to the communities in which they serve. Or they're providing really crucial back office support. In one charity we fund in Hertfordshire, volunteers provide 250 hours of time in support for the service each week. That's worth about £100,000 a year, more than 3 times the amount that organisation gets from its local council. But they don't just leverage human resources, they also leverage cash. What we call a gearing effect, because by being in your areas, they bring in individuals to support them, they bring in businesses to support them, they bring in foundations like us to support them. And a typical example of a domestic abuse charity we fund in the north of England receives 1/3 of its money from statutory people like you, 1/3 from local donations, and 1/3 from organisations like us, bringing money into your communities from outside. Those extra money and that extra pounds wouldn't exist without the money from you. And if you don't exist, we wouldn't fund them. We would fund someone else, somewhere else. So in sum, local charities make your money work harder, not just in what they do, but in the local social capital they bring into your communities and they generate, and in the cash they bring into your communities. Cash. When local charities do, maps really well onto your services. We've tried to map them roughly around county and district councils, and these are some of the areas that almost all of the organisations we're involved in are doing. It may map very well onto your own priorities. Let me give one example. The charity that we fund and been funding as a domestic abuse worker, a caseworker, has been funded by Herts County Council. That service was designed with local charities by Herts County Council. It led to commissioning 4 domestic abuse caseworkers across the county, one of which is attached to this county. That caseworker enables women to access wraparound services through things like a job club, a women's group, art therapy, family law, counselling, which is then funded by extra resources that charity brings in from outside of the council into Hertfordshire. It's supported by 28 volunteers, and that includes placement from local trainee counsellors who come in and work as part of their training with the charity. And because the team is small, they make rapid decisions. They work closely in partnership with other organisations, and they refer people on. They have very strong relationships with organisations that deal with issues like law and benefits and money and housing, some of the key issues for men and women facing domestic abuse. And they feed their expertise back into the county council so it can think about how it continues to improve its services. So pause for a moment and think about that gearing. For every £37 Hertfordshire gives to that charity, they bring in £63 cash to Hertfordshire. We've invested £100,000 in that charity between 2017 and 2021, and we'll invest another £100,000 for the next 3 years after that. That money wouldn't have come into Hertfordshire without Hertfordshire County Council's funding. And alongside the 28 volunteers. So now, that's the story of one. And you'll say, that's only one. You'll say, individually tiny. Multiply that thousands and thousands of times. In aggregate, these organisations are incredibly important to your communities when you bring them all together. And they are a huge opportunity, but equally, there will be a huge consequence if they disappear. And some of you might be thinking, it's all very well for you as a funder. We have a public duty, you do. You are locally accountable. And not all small local charities are good, and we would absolutely agree with that. So whilst we are passionate about local small charities, we come to it with open eyes, not rose-tinted spectacles. We have taken a long, hard look at ourselves over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, we funded broad-based community work community centres, youth centres, but because money was so tough to get for some local organisations and some local causes, we thought very hard about what we fund, and we made some really tough choices. We stopped funding work with children because we saw that it was relatively easy to get it funded. We stopped funding broad-based community work because it was great, but from our perspective, not vital. We thought about how we fund the most effective organisations, who are often not the most visible, because they're focused on what they do, not pitches to us as a funder or to you as councils. So now we go through a really rigorous due diligence process that includes face-to-face contact with each organisation that we fund. So we visit thousands of small organisations every year across the country, and we ask them to show us, how are you focused on your service users? How do you measure outcomes? And how are you accountable? And particularly, how are you governed? Does your board work? And we've recognised that often the charities that are the best at delivering services in your communities are sometimes the least able to tick all the organisational due diligence boxes. Because quite often, they're run by somebody who's come straight off the front line. They know all about the issue, but they may never have run an organisation. It may be the first time they're a chief executive or the first time they're director. So we have developed a wide range of organisational support to strengthen these organisations, which is mapped here over the last 5 years. A huge range of things that you'll see here around leadership, around effective communications, around sustainable fundraising and financing, core organisation development support that we think is a really crucial part of our offer. All of this is optional. Much of it is pro bono, and wherever we possibly can and we buy a service, we buy it local, to retain money in your local economies. All of it is good value for money. It costs us, alongside our £100,000 or £200,000 over 6 years, between £3,000 and £4,000 a year to provide this service for each charity, to strengthen them as organisations and recognise that mismatch sometimes between quality of service and quality of governance and back office. But if these local organisations survive, they need you too. They need you to do your bit. Because our equivalent of the LGA, which is the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, publishes an annual almanac of what's happening in our sector. And it tells us there's been a huge shift away from funding local charities to shifting to scale. Earned income from local government to charities has fallen by 44% in the last 5 years. And yet local government earned income for large charities, which are largely national, has risen by a fifth. At present, 86p of every local and national government pound to the voluntary sector goes to charities with an income of over £1 million. 86p out of every pound. And as ever, because it's charities of over £1 million, that's 3% of the sector. Those will probably be large local organisations that are not based in your communities. We see this shift ourselves. We see a shift to county-wide contracts. We see a shift to standardisation over specialisation. We see a focus on balance sheets and financial collateral over outcomes and purpose. And at one level, all of that is a completely rational response to what for you is a really tough environment too, to your wish to reduce risk. On another level, it's almost perfectly designed, albeit unintentionally, to exclude small local charities from contracting. And as a consequence, many of the local organisations we fund, and we fund some of the best, are really struggling. In the face of rising demand that you're seeing too, that demand's becoming more complex as austerity has driven it, but with falling budgets, especially from statutory bodies, whether they're local authorities, from the NHS, and police and crime commissioners, or central government, like the Ministry of Justice. And we know you know this too. One of my colleagues went to the Tory Party conference earlier this year and was struck by a past chair, Paul Carter, I don't know if he's still in the room, from Kent, and he talked poignantly at the Fringe meeting there, and he said broadly, and I'm interpreting here, he entered office to grow and develop Kent and wishing to work with local charities, but he'd been forced to cut, contract, and commission at scale. So we know that some of this drive to scale is also about risk, but if Carillion tells you anything, it tells you that scale can concentrate risk. I sit on the CIPFA, Charity Public Finance Accountants Group, the Charity and Public Finance Group, that's about to publish one of his insight documents on contracting with small local charities. And one of your directors of finance is quoted in it as saying, "We've realised that big does not always equal beautiful." And he's right. So, as I've said, we know this isn't easy. What might better look like? Well, I have 3 suggestions for you. I'm not a local government expert, but we have 3 suggestions for you. My first suggestion would be to get strategic and get local. Think about where your local voluntary sector can add the most value and see it not as a contractor, but recognise it as a partner with a shared agenda and work with it. Realize that in the voluntary sector, what you think you see isn't always what you get. The best organizations may not be the biggest, they're probably not the loudest, they may not be the ones you know, they may not have professional bidding teams, they may not be able to tick all your contract boxes, but those that do and can do that are probably doing it because they're focused primarily on your purchasing and procurement systems, and secondly, on local people. And the only way to find out about them is to get out and see them and visit them, as we do ourselves. My second suggestion to you is to think about joining the Keep It Local network. We're working and partnering with an organization called Locality that I hope some of you know, which supports a network of 600 local community organizations across England and helps councils keep it local with resources, advice, and support. It aims to support commissioners to think local and unlock the power of community. And it has 6 design principles. Its first design principle in thinking about funding local is to think whole system, not individual service silos. Design services with local organizations and the people they serve. Engage early on that. Examples on the website, things like the Integrated Care Partnership in North Nottinghamshire, which has brought together all the players around the complex social care issues that North Nottinghamshire faces to work together collectively. The second principle is to coordinate services at local or neighbourhood level. Invest in your local economy. Commit to proactively supporting local organisations by default. Get out and see them and shift the relationship you have with them from one which is transactional to one which is relational. Sunderland is pioneering at micro level, area-based approaches, bringing people together to collaborate, not compete, to kick off hyper-local initiatives that deal with issues in local areas. The third principle is to deliberately focus on local spend first to invest in your local economy. And to achieve the gearing that I talked about earlier, Claire's the Centre for Local Economic Strategies talks about community wealth building. This is not new money. It's trying to deploy the money you already have, but committing to use it with local organisations by default. County councils and district councils play a really crucial role here as exemplars and conveners, working with others who don't instinctively think local, like the NHS in particular, and colleges and local businesses. As leaders yourselves, I ask you to make sure your targets are not conflicting with that relational and local approach. Target impact, not reductions in numbers of contracts. The fourth principle is focused on early intervention now to save costs tomorrow. As we should in homelessness, that's not happening. Achieving that long-term value means that you need to think long-term too. Local organisations can help you do that. Small local organisations, we think, are especially effective at what we call secondary prevention, which is where we know there's an issue, and what you want to do is make sure that issue is not going to be exacerbated by intervening early. Small local organisations can be really effective at the secondary prevention, which prevents those really high-cost tertiary interventions. In particular, we fund a lot of work with young parents, many of whose children are at high risk of going into care. We fund work with sex workers, the same issue. Early intervention with these communities can really stop that high cost of kids ending up in care, which you will pick up the tab of. The fifth principle is to commit to your community and proactively support local organisations by being ambitious about social value, because it will help. The Social Value Act enables you to have regard to your area's economic and social well-being in making your procurement decisions. So ask, do you have a social value policy which emphasises the importance of local value? We know there's a growing interest in this. We know the number of councils with social value policies has doubled in the last 3 years. Give social value a heavy weighting in decisions you make about the choices that you make. Think widely about whether social value can be generated in different ways, through things like volunteer engagement, not just obvious things like apprenticeships. And the sixth and last principle is to commission simplest by default. Think about devolution of delivery, if you like, in the way that you talked about devolution this morning. That's critical for small charities who are often excluded unintentionally. Think practically. Think smaller pots, not county-wide pots. Think grants. They don't have to be more risky. As a grant maker, we make choices about who we fund based on those that are best around due diligence by doing that. And think about stage placements. Think about cash flow for small local organisations that often won't have lots of money in the bank to be able to deal with a contract that's paid after the event rather than before. Think cultural. Think local organisations need you to shift from asking, can you do things differently, is often the question to them, to a conversation with them about how do we think differently together about dealing with the issues in our areas. And thinking about risk sits very much with that. That flexibility to do things differently already exists through the light touch procurement regime, which enables you to think differently. We know that some county councils are already doing that. We know that Cambridgeshire, through its Think Community, encourages community-led solutions that work with communities to harness local capacity. Through Keep It Local, we're seeing local authorities doing things differently, whether it's in Bradford, Bristol, Newcastle or Hackney. And we would very much welcome more county councils to think about whether the Keep It Local principles might work for you to make sure the money you have is invested and generates resources in your own communities. So my third and final suggestion to you is to think about your roles as conveners of place. This is not all about money. You are enormously powerful and influential as brokers, bringing local people, local businesses, and local funders like us, community foundations, for example, together. We're realizing the same ourselves, and we're beginning to test approaches of what we can do, working in places like Great Yarmouth in Norfolk, in Norfolk, to think about how we can bring communities together, to try to think differently about how they support local organizations. So, in conclusion, doing nothing doesn't seem like an option. We know some of this isn't easy, but nor is the status quo. Doing more of the same isn't going to work. Difficult times require difficult thinking and different thinking. So just as we've had to rethink our work at the Foundation, I'd encourage you to radically rethink your approach to working with small local organizations in your areas, to turn your contract thinking on its head, to start with the presumption that local knows best, because from our experience it does, and that commissioning should enable that, not disable it. And if you do, you won't be walking alone. The thinking around working local is spreading. The government civil society strategy, which was written by Danny Kruger, who is about to, no doubt, win the seat of Devizes in Wiltshire, wrote the civil society strategy, which talks a great deal about the value of small and local. The Ministry of Justice, after the fiasco of transforming rehabilitation, has finally recognised that small local organisations are a key part of its ambitions to deliver what it wishes to deliver around supporting reoffenders. And as I've said to you, CIPFA, perhaps the most conservative of local authority bodies, is thinking more about how it can support you, and particularly work in your procurement, to think and act locally. The foundation I run, and many like us, are often vicarious co-funders with you. We fund with you. We've done it for years. And as foundations, we are experts in small local charities. I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert in local authority provision. We're experts in grants, not commissioning. But if we can completely re-engineer our approach and thinking with a staff team of less than 20 who work in my grant-making team, then perhaps so can you. So here's an offer. Sadly, with the size of organisation we have, we can't work with each of you. But if the County Council network wanted to think about working differently, we would be delighted to work with a group of you to think about what that might mean, to pick up some of the themes that I've addressed as part of my conversation with you. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Paul. And I think you've brought out some of the frustration that I certainly had when I was leader of Wiltshire Council, that as things got tougher and procurement got stronger and commissioning had more and more regulations to it, it seemed, that we didn't have that flexibility to work with the smaller charities in the way we used to in the past. And I think if we can turn that round now and work with you, I think that would be a really good way of working. I do know that we did it through putting money into communities, and communities then often did support local charities. Much of the community money went to local charities, and for every pound we put in the end, we were getting £7 back from other sources. So it's good value for your councils, but sometimes I think the structures we put in place put a barrier there. So I've got a couple of questions that have come in. First of all, have you found a gap being created by the move towards social prescribing, which has put extra pressure on local charities that's not been filled by funding from either the local authorities or the NHS?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. I've been talking to Paul Farmer, who was on my board, but also is the Chief Executive of Mind. And we're quite concerned, actually, about the NHS funding link workers, which is a really good idea. NHS England has funded, as you will probably know, a series of link workers whose job it is to link people through GPs and others with social prescribing into local organisations. But while the link workers are funded, There is no funding then to fund the activity that subsequently follows. So we're in that double bind again of charities wanting to meet a need, but finding actually there's no additional resources to meet the extra demand. So we are concerned. We like the idea. The idea of helping people with mental health navigate through link workers is a great idea. I mean, this is one of the, particularly with mental health, you think social prescribing works. But the same is true of physical health too. Again, we're talking about people who will be prescribed to local organisations, but there's usually no money that follows with it. So you're talking about rising demand and no additional expenditure to be able to meet demand. And the danger with that for us is that the charities that are best resourced in the most prosperous areas will probably respond to that and might raise more money. The charities that are the least resourced in the poorest areas will be less likely to be able to raise the additional resource to meet the demand. Yep. So it compounds the inequality. Yep.
So no solutions?
No.
No, right.
But local authorities, I mean, if one thing local authorities need to do is be talking about the NHS, because I know from our experience that a lot of the problems that fall at your door start with the NHS, and I speak as an NHS non-executive director of a mental health trust, so we see that.
Well, maybe we need to be thinking more as we go to social health and social care integration about those follow-on things for social prescribing. I've got a lady now in the audience. I've got one more question that I'll keep to the end.
I mean, there's an 80-20 rule on this. If you think about the people who are being socially prescribed, there are people like me, I might need a bit of exercise and a bit of cycling. I'm probably going to, with a mild nudge, I will do it. But actually, if I've just come out of prison and I've got a drug and alcohol problem and I experience abuse, there's no way that I'm going to trust my GP. The amount of intervention that's going to be needed there, and yet the cost of me is going to be enormous. So, you know, I think we need to think about some of those people with complex social needs who could probably really benefit from the sorts of interventions that social prescribing will do, but the cost of delivering that is enormous, but so is the benefit.
Is there any more questions from the audience? No? Well, I have one last question, which I think is an interesting one. What is the one question you think we should mull over about how we work with the voluntary sector as we travel home?
I think local government generally, and the CCN in particular, but also the LGA, need to see the voluntary sector as completely at one with each other. We have a completely shared agenda with you about proper resourcing of local services and your ability to support local services, because we have seen the impact of austerity and the impact of the local organisations we fund. So I think see us as, I mean, at national level, as national leaders, see us as partners. Stop seeing us as contractors. See us as partners in common cause around agendas that we will absolutely share with you. And actually, if you bring together the combined influencing powers of local government with charities, because there are many people in Parliament who have a charity background, then I think we're quite an influential lobby group. But we tend not to work together on policy issues. We see ourselves in opposition rather than as partners.
Thank you. Nothing else? Then I thank you, Paul. Thank you. I think that was a fitting finish to our conference this year. I know that the voluntary sector is such an important part, particularly with our rural counties. They are the people that deliver many of our extra services. I always think it's the jam on the bread and butter that we deliver. So I hope that the CCN can work. I'm looking at David. I hope that the CCN can work closely with you, and if we can help in any way to move your work forward, I hope we can do that. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you.